Thank you very much, and it's a great honor, a pleasure, and privilege to be here today to learn from this great presentations from your work and to have the privilege to use a little bit of your time for some reflections from the perspective of political sociology. I live about 35 kilometers from here, and whenever I can, I get on my bike and I ride through the landscape, which is really romantic, which is really calm, especially in contrast to the urban centers of modernity and all the hustle and the bustle we see there. And this is one of the main reasons why Paul Schulze-Naumburg chose this location, I think. It is wonderful that the Design Academy is creating new things in this place where the old and the new are still present in a way, here between forests, mountains, and the Saale River, away from the centers of modernity. Paul Schulze-Naumburg worked 100 years ago. He became an agitating racist and anti-Semite. As you know, he organized the so-called Bund Heimatschutz, which is a federation homeland protection around the turn of the 20th century. This organization not only focused on regional nature and environmental care, but he saw also himself as a resolute opponent of purely materially orientated industrial progress. The capitalist industrial state was seen as a threat not only for native nature, but especially to the German national identity and the German soul, or the Volksseele. The contemporary far right refers positively to Schulze-Naumburg as one of the genuinely right-wing ecologists. At the turn of the century, Schulze-Naumburg fought, among other things, against the industrial use of the rapids near Laufenberg in the Rhine on the Lake Constance for the purpose of a large hydroelectric power plant. What would Schulze-Naumburg likely say about our current times and today's event? It doesn't really care, but it's just an experiment. Surely, he would oppose wind turbines. He would find the construction of the large bridge for a new road, you should have seen it near here, which local resistance are protesting against, to be ugly, but perhaps to be necessary, as long as it served the fatherland and the race. For sure, he who fought against cultural Bolshevism and modernism would despise the Design Academy and this conference. So you have done everything right. The fact that 100 years later, fascists in Europe and North America are again blaming, attacking, and even murdering people as cultural Marxists calls into question the much praised work of reconciliation through the past in Germany and over Germany. For today's lecture, I read some texts by Schulze-Naumburg. What is shocking about them is not primarily his racism, but the topicality of the discourse patterns of his often culturally based racism, which can still be found today not only on the far right, but also in the mainstream of society. Schulze-Naumburg belonged to those intellectuals who, not only with extreme racism and their active support for the Nazi regime, bear responsibility for the mass murder of Jews, non-whites, homosexuals, Sinti and Romani, sick and disabled, leftists, artists, intellectuals, and others. Schulze-Naumburg represented an ecologically, culturally, and racially based reading of the ideological culture despair of the so-called conservative revolution, which importance, following the historian Fritz Stern, is often underestimated in relation to the atrocities committed by the Germans. The conservative revolutionaries, on whom many European neo-fascists, intellectuals, and agitators modeled themselves, constantly lament decline and decay, destruction of culture, tradition, and identity, or, like Schulze-Naumburg, changes and damage to the environment because of modernity. They described modernity, the values of Enlightenment and the French Revolution, as the origins of ruin and disparaged democracy. They were the pioneers of national socialism. Inequality was and is at the core of the far right of right-wing extremism. The past they wanted to recapture was organized to maintain inequality. Schulze-Naumburg said that it was a mistake that the working class had taken up the false doctrine of the equality of people. In reality, he said, nothing was more unequal than people, and this inequality could not be eliminated by environmental influences or developments. He wrote, selection for the purpose of adaptation to the environmental world has unfortunately hardly been consciously applied so far, and thus abandoned any relation under ecological pretexts. I spare you even more extreme quotes. He was a companion of many intellectual conservative revolutionaries who blamed liberalism for the alleged downfall of the Abendland West. Liberalism was the main enemy of the fascists that is still at least on par with socialism. The ideology of national socialism and its pioneers, the cultural despair of the conservative revolution in the fields of culture and intellectual lives, followed on the footsteps of Christian anti-Judaism and constructed the enemy image of the powerful, rich, and ruthless Jews as a personalization of the hated modern identity. According to this view, the Jews were behind both communism and capitalism and were to blame for the fact that the assumed natural inequality of people, nations, and races was increasingly being dissolved by social, political, and technical measures. In the Weimar Republic, the reactionary push towards the past became more and more extreme. Modernity, with its idea of human equality, was regarded as unnatural and sought against as self-destructive. At the same time, the democratic claim of equality of opportunity and rights was by no means close to being achieved, and as you know, it is still not. Today's backlash movements are still directed against equality and justice, especially in the fields of race, gender, and class. The more visible the unsubstantiality of the pretests for justifying inequality were and are, the more aggressively and irrationally its supporters and profiteers insist on it. Conspiracy narratives, usually structured in anti-Semitic terms, are an expression of this radicalization. The pseudo-theories of human race, industrial annihilation, spatial imperialism, and World War II were the results of these ideologies. However, the authoritarian nationalist and usually anti-Semitic and, of course, racist struggle against modernity was never a struggle against the use of modern technology for one's own cause. From the Volksempfänger and the Volkswagen to the V2 rockets and today's social media and AI, fascist movements have always pioneered the use of modern technology for their political interests. The relationship between racism and social space in the right-wing thought, which is also expressed in aesthetic questions, stands for claims to supremacy based on brutality and the exercise of power. The simultaneity between, first, the romantic transfiguration of environment and nature, in Hitler's case especially the mountains, as you can see in this propaganda photograph here, he's head of the mountains. Second, the brute urban architecture for the purpose of demonstration of powers, and third, the industrial rationality of human extermination plans and war production show what it was all really about, the domination of man and nature. The correspondent on the total claim of the national socialist regime to imitate the supposed naturalness of the hierarchies between living beings in nature and the social world by using extreme violence. Fascist ecology is not based on the view that man and nature are one, but on the conviction that politics must imitate the ruthlessness of eating and being eating in nature and the means of industrial technologies instead of using them to improve the living conditions for everyone. In our days of a rapidly escalating climate crisis, eco-fascist voices are growing louder again. Like democratization and industrialization in the past, they are now fighting decarbonization and transformation as downfall for the homeland, for the economy, for the culture, and as illustrated by the emotional defense of big cars and constant meat consumption. As posters at protests from our days, like this poster, slurs can be seen that show solar and wind energy are the war against the people of the land, das Landvolk. In the US, in New Zealand, in Germany, even racist terrorist attacks justify their violence in eco-fascist terms. It's offensive to quote in a way, but we have to understand. They say that the number of non-whites must be reduced in order to save the white race and their homeland. These extreme eco-fascist voices are in the minority, but they point to one of the ways in which the escalating crisis can be dealt with ideologically without challenging one's own privileges. Another, of course, problematic approach to global warming still dominates the anti-ecological discourses. It's a denial of the existence, the human and industrial influences, the changeability of climate change. Pseudo-studies, board experts, fear-mongering, disinformation, and downplaying of climate change are part of prevailing discourses and ideologies. Both the denial of man-made climate change and eco-fascist and eco-nationalist plans go hand in hand. Many activists and researchers conclude that climate change is a structurally racist phenomenon. Even IPCC reports acknowledging colonialism as a driver of climate change reinforce what indigenous people across the globe have been declaring for decades. Eamon Itwin explains the connection between colonialism and climate change with a historical example. She says, it started 1452, the year when black people were first enslaved on the island of Madeira to work. In the same year, Columbus' discovery of the sea routes to America began the continental mass enslavement of people from African countries. The colonialists forced them to clear forests for plantations where they were then further exploited. Our capital markets today were created by enslavement in the first place. That's because the incredible profits that we were captured through it made industrialization possible. This means that the reason greenhouse gases could be released is much further in the past than most people here want to believe. And that enslavement and colonialism have played a central role in this. Today's attempts to counteract climate change through tree planting in the global south also reflect a neo-ecological logic. For these areas, local smallholders who previously used the land are expropriated in green-grabbing processes, and instead of converting areas of commercial agriculture in the global north for the purpose of reforestation and climate protection, even in climate protection measures, those who are those who are least responsible suffer again. Vijama Rajamadran, Director of Energy and Development at California's Breakthrough Institute, calls the climate policies of the rich global north green colonialism, claiming that it keeps poorer countries in the global south dependent. Elisabeth Yempierre, who is active in the Climate Justice Alliance, also analyzes the connection between climate change and colonialism. She describes climate change as a result of the legacy of colonialism and slavery, citing a long history of exploitation of land and labor in order to build a capitalist society and provide resources for the privileged. Jean-Pierre draws a direct connection between the I Can't Breathe protests of the Black Lives Matter movement. In 2014, Eric Garner, an African-American man with asthma, was killed by using a prohibited chokehold by police officers. Video footage shows him shouting, "I can't breathe," several times before his death. These were also George Floyd's last words, repeated for minutes before he was killed in 2020 by a white police officer who pressed his knees on Floyd's neck. Respiratory elements like asthma are more common among Black, indigenous, and people of color, and because of environmental racism, they statistically suffer particularly badly from air pollution. Therefore, the I Can't Breathe slogan represents also the fight against environmental racism. So, from the history to today, racism has never been a true scientific doctrine. The doctrine of existence of human races, as taken to the extremes by the National Socialists, has never held a gain of truth. And yet, racism was and is real because it is a pseudo-scientific permission of inequality. By denying people equal worth, equal entitlements, and equal rights on supposed natural or cultural grounds, racism serves to justify exploitation. Racism is not just an individual prejudice, you know it. It is the perpetuation of structural power relations that have their material and ideological roots in the area of colonialism and still exist today. In this sense, climate racism describes on a structural level the externalization of the ecological costs of the industrial prosperity of the majority white West at the expense of the majority non-white regions and people that are most affected. Climate racism is both the structure and the mechanism that produces and legitimizes the structures. Climate racism as a global principle of inequality shapes our everyday practices of our everyday practical reality of life. It is part of the everyday practice that connects each one of us to these structures. The consequences of carbon emissions and environmental damage in the extraction of raw materials are felt above all by those who are already marginalized in several intersectionary dimensions. People and areas statistically most affected by climate change are not white, they are poor, they are more often female. About 120 years ago, Schulze Naumburg argued against a hydroelectric power plant, which is now considered as a climate-friendly technology. More than 100 years later, this topic is even more relevant than ever. Wind turbines are a major source of conflict. Of course, there are some valid arguments why wind turbines are worse in some places than others. There is misinformation, there were campaigns founded by fossil fuel interests. The attitude of many when it comes to landscape changes for renewable energies, such as wind turbines or power lines, is not in my backyard, and the question is in whose backyard then? However, every time we find a wind turbine aesthetically displeasing or are annoyed by paper drinking straw, we should remember that the same system that imposes regulations on millions of people to act in an environmentally friendly way, that makes energy and everyday's good more expensive nowadays. The same system allows a few super rich people to emit even more carbon in 1 week with their private planes, mega yachts, and the luxury consumption than average citizens do in their entire life. Super rich emit 1,000 times as much greenhouse gases as an average person. How could this be fair. It is not climate protection. It's not. Climate protection is not a lifestyle issue. It's not just about how you eat or how your mobility is structured. It is a social, it is a class, it is a gender, it is a racial inequality issue, as well as a global and generational issue. The fine word of freedom, used to defend the status quo and often concealed with the fact that this freedom is exclusive, and thus not a real freedom that ends with the freedom of when the freedom of others is violated. It's not freedom, it's privilege, historically grown, inherited advantage to the detriment of others. For every ton of carbons emitted, there is a ton that will not be available for others before planetary boundaries are exceeded. On the African continent, the average emissions are 1 ton per person, of course, with significant differences between the different African countries. In Germany, it's 11 tons, in the US and in China, even more. How could this be fair? Why is this accepted? Are Africans different? Do they not deserve the same opportunities for releasing greenhouse gases, for prosperity, and for living conditions? Just one example. More than 1,700 people died and 8 million have been displaced due to the floods in Pakistan summer last year, which cost around 30 billion euros at damage. At the COP27 climate conference, the country demanded compensation, reparation from the industrialized countries that are responsible for climate change, arguing that the main culprits should pay for the damage inflicted on the most affected. According to a study of the London School of Economics, the amount needed to compensate for climate damage could rise as much as 1.8 trillion euros annually by 2050. But the counter-reaction to the polluter pays principle is nationalism. It is not a coincidence that many of the states whose past and present are marked by colonialism, industrialization, and high greenhouse gas emissions, and whose elites benefit especially from global inequalities, have in recent years produced strong right-wing authoritarian to fascist movements and parties whose lowest common ground is the defense of the old power structures. This includes the opposition to the emancipation of women and non-binary people, equal rights for immigrants, effective climate protection, indigenous populations, critical research on racism, a genuine coming to terms with the past. It includes as well the regulation of the financial markets and redistribution from the bottom to the top, while declaring a cultural war in which the middle classes are persuaded that they are victims of a global woke elites war. These backlash movements are led by sections of the traditional elites who see their positions of status and power threatened by the drive and thrive on the fear that globalization, immigration, and ecologism could challenge their prosperity and privileges. More than any other issue, climate change exposes extreme inequalities while challenging the narratives of neoliberal capitalism of the past decades. For if it is true that the downsides of prosperity and growth not only call into question the life chances of the population in the global south, the poor, women, the sick, the elderly, and other vulnerable groups as a whole, then the myth that success and prosperity of the individual depend solely on one's own diligence and ability is being debunked, as are the illusions of equal opportunities and that growth, prosperity, and wealth benefits everyone and harms no one. The climate crisis is a fact-checking of the ruling ideologies of capitalism. It would be convenient to continue telling the story of the liberal promises of progress, faith in technology and development processes that have been successful in many aspects, including human rights. However, this all ends with the planetary boundaries, because climate change is a justice issue and it challenges capitalist ideologies. It is easy to denounce climate justice with old anti-communist phrases. If you listen to climate researchers, it is still possible through radical decarbonization to correct the mistakes of the past, or at least to limit global warming to a non-catastrophic level. But unfortunately, no Western industrialized country is on track to achieve these goals, not because it's not possible in a technical way, but it's not wanted on the political sphere. People rebel when their ideas and expectations no longer match reality. To avoid cognitive dissonance, we look for confirmation. In a reality marked by extreme inequality, the proliferation of ideologies that frame inequalities, poverty, discrimination, disadvantage, and exclusion as natural, as just, or as self-responsible is not surprising. Racism, supremacism, religious ideologies, conspiracy ideologies, plutocracy, and anti-state liberalism are extreme results of an over-adjusting to material reality and trying to make sense of contradictions that we have to understand. Their followers are not crazy. These guys are not crazy. They are radicalizing the status quo in an overwrought way. If we take climate change seriously, we need to expose its material and ideological causes, as well as the lobbies, the lies, and belittling narratives that maintain the self-destructive status quo. We are talking about big corporations, lobby groups, think tanks, national parties, and international networks that have been denying climate change for decades and spending billions to suppress green ideas and technologies. The climate crisis is a crisis of inequality because those who contribute to the least suffer the most, not just on a global, but even on a regional, on a urban level. And on the other hand, those who bear the greatest responsibility still benefit the most and at the same time have the most opportunities to protect themselves from the destructive consequences. Are the workers who depend on their old gasoline cars to feed their families are to blame? Or the political and economically desired structures, and which, as we saw in some of the presentations as well, for decades and against better knowledge, produced manipulation, for example, of emission values, lobbied against regulation and against public infrastructure, build ever larger cars, designing cities full of roads and parking lots instead of affordable housing and public transport. Space has multi-layered effects. How much space do cars, pedestrians, or cyclists get? Who is more powerful? The one whose vehicle symbolizes the greatest capital? These questions are not just practical questions. They shape everyday life, culture, reality, and ideology. Without climate justice, meaning class justice or social justice, racial justice, gender justice, generational justice, and some other aspects, a democratic future is unimaginable. This must find practical expression in the fact that the more rich and powerful, the main perpetrators of global warming, must use their opportunities to protect the poor, the vulnerable, and powerless from destructive consequences of climate change. But, as we experience every day, most of them do not do this voluntarily. But every social and emancipatory movement has fought for change in the face of opposition. That's what we saw in presentations before as well. Anti-modern, eco-fascist ideologies, such as exposed by Schulz and Naumburg, are not an alternative. They are anti-human, they are anti-democratic. Their focus is not the protection of the global climate change and humankind, but the unity of blood and soil. The polarization and radicalization of parts of the ruling class we experience in political reality shows the relevance of a warning of the German publicist Hans Magnus Enzensberger, who wrote 50 years ago about the critique of political ecology. Fascism could easily turn the struggle for a clean environment around for its own capital interests. Enzensberger noted that fascism has already proven itself as the savior in an extreme crisis situation and as administrator of scarcity. In the event of an ecological catastrophe that can be perceived immediately and on a mass scale, the ruling class would not hesitate to resort to fascist solutions. And nowadays, right-wing agitators are currently calling climate activists, climate scientists, and green politicians not just cultural Marxists, but as well things like you are the real eco-fascists or terrorists. But when in reality, fascism is a tangible option for defending the status quo of extreme inequality. Fascism is the option of the profiteers and the powerful to insulate themselves from global dislocation, from change, from justice movements, and from climate migration. The ideological isolation precedes the physical isolation with walls and soldiers. The amplifiers of disinformation and myths usually boost to having the real truth. They say that climate change is just the invention of a global elite to scare and oppress population and to become even richer and more powerful. Claiming at the same time, climate change is a communist hoax. Again, conspiratorial powers are constructed that would destroy the nations either through communism or woke liberalism. These twisted ideas only work because society normally does not dare to question the ruling ideologies of neoliberal capitalism. Even leaving aside the scientific facts, isn't it much more obvious that some elites in business and politics have only become powerful and rich because of the same developments that caused climate change and global warming? No lobby is more powerful and has more influence in recent decades on the public discourse, on media coverage and policy decisions, from subsidized to the way our cities and mobility are shaped than fossil fuel industry lobbies. Criticism of this kind is ideological. The ecological transformation, green ideas are ideological. Climate activism is ideological. We hear these formulations all day in public discourse. Ideological is always the others. The ideology of the supposedly unideologically is particularly powerful and exhausting. It is a blunt defense of self-reflection about the fact that every view of the world is in a way ideological, including the view of the respective ruling ideology, which is more than just the expression of the ruling conditions, it is a justification of ruling conditions. Everything is the way it is, because it is the logic. But as Greta Thunberg said, change is coming whether you like it or not. Is design unideological? Does a world on fire need design? Can art, architecture, culture, and intellectual discourse make a difference? I think yes. It's not about instruction, indoctrination, or education, not only about this, but about power and about visibility. Making the invisible visible. Making visible the ambivalence of continuities and contingencies, conflict and harmony, irritation and clarity. Art cannot be apolitical any more than science or any other public activity. We can only live in the illusion of neutrality as long as we refuse to acknowledge that the revelation or concealment always serves someone, either the profiteers or the victims of the social order, as Pierre Bourdieu wrote. It is easy to individualize and to complicate it, to criticize the system in which we ourselves are enmeshed, and from which many of us benefit daily, especially me as a white cis man. But it's our responsibility to use these privileges of intellectual and cultural spaces, not just for things like self-realization or success. And we saw in the presentation before how this in a very, very great way can be realized to something good. We have to use our responsibility, of course, never to legitimize in a way fascist ideologies like Schulze-Naumburg and his comrades in arms did, but to find new, optimistic, and progressive ways. In sociological thinking, as in art and in the design of spaces, this means linking the private with the public. This is the main aspect, linking the private with the public and going into conflicts that count. We must resist the isolation and the private and open spaces for, as we've seen, communities. We must at the same time resist romanticizations as well as anti-Semitic and nationalistic transfiguration of nature and homeland, Heimat, the cultural despair ideologies, and a naive belief in modernity. We must not only design but also implement just and optimistic ideas for the future. Sociologist Zygmunt Bauman wrote about the ambivalence of modernity. If the battle cry of modernity was liberty, equality, fraternity, then liberty, diversity, tolerance was a ceasefire formula of postmodernity. And when tolerance is transformed into solidarity, the ceasefire can even become peace. And since you are all very visual people, I'm not. This is what artificial intelligence says, what this piece could look like. Thank you for your attention. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Matthias, for reminding us that we don't only have to deal with the past, also with the present and the future, of course, and that everything is connected and always having an effect on each other. So, are there questions? Who's first?
Thank you very much for the presentation. I think it was really interesting for you to draw attention to the disparities, obviously in carbon footprint, but also in the discourses that are unfolding right now around the responsibilities that are being held on those carbon emissions. So my question would be, based on the research that you have conducted, how do you see the next stage? I mean in terms of actionable stages. And I know that there's a lot of spatial practitioners here working various lines of work. What do you feel is the most efficient way we can use our platforms or our practices to enact a better future?
That's a great and very complicated question because there are so much and at the same time so small possibilities. Yeah, right. The spaces for a real radical approach is just in my eyes. It's, as we saw in the presentations before, on a very concrete local community level. But at the same time, big problem is to link what is happening locally with the global sphere and with the global inequalities, because we know that we can't stop climate change just in one country or on one continent, but it's a global problem. And what we see is the backlash to nationalism, even to localism, and the question how to break this boundaries between it. I'm not an expert of architecture and these things, but I do think that it really makes a difference if you are in Las Vegas or in Copenhagen, because on the one side it's extremely concentrated and capitalized. On the other side, you see in Copenhagen how the public space and the private space finds together, where there is common ground, and there is common spaces where you can not just educate yourself and others, but have a kind of mixing of the spheres that you can feel. I think that you should, it's your task to find this. I can just say something and describe, yeah? I can just describe what I see, what's happening on the far right, and in my eyes, what's happening on the far right, from Trump to Bolsonaro to what's going on in Europe, is the biggest threat for not just for human rights, but for the ecological crisis as well. And your benefit is that you don't have to be political, but you are political in a way, yeah? So you don't have to go into this debates or to debunk how the far right is arguing and doing things, but you can install and implement a better reality and a better sphere of experiences. And this is what, on an emotional way, is, I think, important to get the support, the acceptance, and a new normality where people feel that the change that is coming is better for not all of us. It's impossible, yeah, because we have to be clear that there are privileged groups who have to lose privilege and power. And this is a question in an intersectional way, especially, and we are here in a very rural environment, where we see that on the global level that the main question is how to address and how to mobilize in the best way, in the best case, the people in more rural environments. I'm very curious in your ideas and projects that are developed here. Yeah.
We're not going to let you off the hook quite that easily. So I'm gonna build on Miriam's question and tie it back actually to Ákos Moravánskij's point earlier on, which was, I think, really getting to, I don't know where you are, Ákos, back there, talking about the use of media, because it seems that part of the question for, so we saw in the presentations of how public can be engaged, and then it's slow, and then it's local, and I think that's one method. And I think you raised the point very accurately of, okay, but this is a problem that goes beyond the local. Yeah. And so I think one question is, how can either scholars like you or policymakers engage the media to be able to grab that ability to communicate to a public at a broader level than the local examples that we saw with both Jermaine and Brian. And so I wonder if there is some way of engaging those mechanisms, even in your field, which is less visual, but is entirely verbal. How can the media actually be used not to have the messages that you were showing that were very frightful or Trumpian, but messages that could actually take this to a larger scale?
I don't know if the media sphere is the most important sphere in this field, because the media sphere is structured in a way, it is structured, and it's very hard to break the Fox monopoly or the Bild-Zeitung monopoly in a way. So again, I would say it's a question of grassroots, to have direct relations that are able to correct disinformation, that to establish experiences that show that it's not true what the real fake news media that exists are providing. So what the far right is doing, they're in a kind of meta-political fight for a kind of hegemony in the civil society. And as we saw in the past decades, that the citizen rights movements are very, in a way, successful, yeah, against all the problems, all the barriers, all the violence, to establish a new form of hegemony. And I think it's the quest of the time to combine the struggles against racism, against far right, for democratization and climate change, and to bring the power of the powerless together, so that what's opposing us or the civil society fails in dividing or in separating or in fragmentation of the topics, because that is what media is really good at, and saying it's the global elites versus the working poor and so on, and we have to prove that the reality shows another form of solidarity.
Thank you very much. I was just wondering, first of all, thank you very much for this fascinating presentation, super interesting. I was wondering what the role of education and curricular structures in this is or should be, because I mean, I come from a generation where we are educated on university levels in a highly specialist way. So it's I mean, this super developed sort of intersectional approach that you apply is not yet anchored on curricular levels in educational systems, and but clearly something we need. I mean, not just, I developed a new arts program. It was very hard institutionally to anchor courses on nature and natural sciences, like, because we need to bridge the humanities and the natural sciences in the first place to develop structures where a younger generation then is able to both apply this kind of, you know, critical thinking coming from the humanities, but also the skills and the knowledge, and then bring this into action. So how do we? So I'm curious if you, in your own academic context, work on this and develop structures that provide abilities for a younger generation to learn the skills that are necessary to think intersectionally, but also to connect theory and practice and critical thinking and scientific thinking and all of these things.
Yes, thanks. This is a great question again, because the problem of establishing structures is a problem of resources, of time, of allies, of possibilities. And at least the German educational sector is very, very complicated and very, in a way, hardened. Honestly, my hope is not about the education, the traditional or structured educational sector. It has to do what it's possible within the sector. But when I talk to my students, and maybe in the US it's another debate, I'm not pretty sure, then they come to university where we don't have, for example, a pretty broad gender program or something. Yeah, but they are self-educated from social media, from their peer groups, that they know much more about the ongoing debates and discourses than we could reflect in the lectures, for example. It's linked, but another problem than the climate change things. So I think we have to strengthen the informal ways of learning, the informal ways of emotionally biased, again, communities and spaces where people can be informed and organized and self-educate themselves over the boundaries that the formal educational system, at least in German, a very strict school-like program in a lot of studies, is making possible. But on the other hand, of course, academia is a sphere where there's a lot of freedom, where there's a lot of freedom of thinking, and the possibility to establish a new combined intersectional programs, for example. It should be used, but it's a very bureaucratical process, at least in Germany and in my experience. Yeah? So we try to do what we can, but the boundaries are small. Yeah.
Thank you, Matthias.
Thank you.